Welcome to the pilot's preliminary briefing for the tutorial series The Art of the Viggen. We will go over a brief synopsis of the module, various settings and options you should consider before flying, a brief cockpit orientation, and recommended Hotas controls to get the most out of the Viggen. Hello fellow virtual aviators, and welcome to our new tutorial series, The Art of the Viggen, an aircraft that doesn't receive the plaudits it deserves in DCS world, because it truly is a wonderful machine and quite unique when compared to other aircraft which originated during the 1970s. Despite ostensibly being a 1970s appliance and a symbol of the Cold War in Scandinavia, the Viggen has repeatedly demonstrated its suitability and capability, and managed to remain in service into the 21st century. The Viggen's unique properties, procedures and methods arise from the fact that although Sweden would be described as a Western country in the Cold War's East-West paradigm, it was unilaterally developed outside of, or rather at a distance from, the usual close cooperation and standards of NATO forces, an organisation which Sweden was not a member of at the time. Consequently, it has a very distinctive feel due to the Swedish Armed Forces doctrine. This makes it an excellent and beautiful addition to DCS world, but a somewhat neglected one, as most virtual pilots tend to focus on big-hitting modules with American, British, French or Russian origins. Hence why we are going to focus on the Viggen in this new series, to give it a little love and hopefully bring to the foreground an aircraft I think warrants consideration. Today we won't be doing any flying, but will be going through a short introduction to help you prepare for our tutorial curriculum. So notepads at the ready as we go through our pilot's preliminary briefing. In this briefing, we will be going over some information that is useful knowledge before flying the Viggen in DCS world. The Viggen, designated the 37 Viggen, was manufactured by the diversified Swedish corporation Saab, developed and originally flown in 1967, but introduced into service in 1971, in the middle of the Cold War. It originated in the Swedish Air Force's need for a multi-role aircraft, to replace its aging Saab 32 Lansen attack aircraft and the radically designed Saab 35 Draken in the fighter role. In accordance with Swedish strategic doctrine, the aircraft had a stringent specification, whereby, amongst other criteria, it had to integrate with Sweden's sterile airborne warfare control system, have integrated computer-controlled weapon systems, be able to operate at low level at supersonic speeds, and be able to operate from short or road-based runways as part of Sweden's BAS-60 dispersal airbase system. The specification led to a radical design in terms of airframe, control, power plant, and most importantly, the first instance of an aircraft using a digital computer based around integrated circuits to manage much of the pilot workload, thereby eliminating the need for a navigator or weapons system operator. At the time of its introduction, it was by far the most technologically advanced frontline combat aircraft in the world. The module in DCS world has been produced by Heatblur Simulations, a company with a proven track record of producing excellent modules from a wide variety of sources and roles. The variant of the Viggen that has been modelled is the AJS-37 Viggen, intended as a multi-role variant. The AJS-37 Viggen is an upgraded version of the earlier AJ-37 variant, whereby various avionics systems were updated in the 1990s. The letters AJS indicate the intended role of the variant in order of primacy. A stands for Attack, referring to strike and ground attack missions. This is most definitely the primary role of the aircraft. J stands for Jakt, the Swedish word for hunting or pursuit, and refers to air-to-air combat. However, it would be reckless to describe the Viggen as a fighter, and its air-to-air capabilities should be thought of as for defensive purposes only. S stands for spanning, the Swedish word for reconnaissance, as the aircraft can be used for monitoring ship positions or for providing ELINT electronic signals intelligence. Under the Special tab in the DCS World options, there is only one option for the Viggen: the ability to customize the cockpit by adding some metric to imperial stickers and information plates. Given that the aircraft primarily uses metric measurement, which you may be less familiar with given the ubiquity of imperial and US customary unit use in aviation, you may wish to consider this. As a Swedish aircraft, we shall be using the default cockpit, which is marked and labelled in Swedish. A complete English cockpit modification is available online should you wish to make this change. In the mission editor, a player or client-based Viggen has the options shown here in the bottom box. The first three refer to weapon parameter options. The Viggen's computer operates using a data cartridge system, the cartridges for which can be generated in various ways. Limitations on the sources of these cartridges can be made using the option at the bottom. Okay, we are sitting in the cockpit of our Viggen, and the layout is fairly typical of a fighter aircraft. Most of our instruments are placed on the front dash or around its periphery, and the majority of our system controls are placed on the left and right consoles and the left and right walls. Now, if this is your first time seeing the Viggen cockpit, don't be fooled. On first glance it looks rather complicated, but the design of the Viggen's systems are generally very intuitive. Secondly, it looks rather low-tech, but this again is a distraction. The integration of its systems for its time is a thing of beauty. We have a right-hand stick for pitch and roll, which is placed centrally between our legs, and a left-hand throttle on the console for thrust. Your control is, as usual, by rudder pedals. Another important control is the radar control stick on the left console shown here, a feature of many third-generation fighters before Hotas radar control. Indeed, we see something similar in the Mirage F1. In terms of visibility, it scores a cool 8.5 out of 10. Our only main obstruction is the bow of the canopy. Apart from this, the forequarter, flanks, above and aft quarter have clear views. We are now going to take a quick guided tour of the various panels, instruments and gauges to help us familiarise ourselves with the cockpit layout. Firstly, the front panel. Our main flight instruments are placed on the left side, including the altimeter, graduated in meters, the combined airspeed and Mach indicator, calibrated in kilometers per hour and Mach number, and a typical spherical attitude director indicator. The front panel is dominated by an instrument known as the central indicator, or CI, which combines functions of a horizontal situation indicator with a radar scope and radar warning receiver. Backup instruments are placed on the right side of the panel, including the standby altimeter, the standby airspeed indicator, the standby attitude indicator, and a backup compass. Engine and fuel management instruments are placed in the bottom right, including the fuel indicator, graduated as a percentage rather than a fuel quantity, the engine RPM indicator, the engine pressure ratio indicator, and the afterburner zone indicator. Two specialist navigation instruments are placed in the upper right corner. These are highly important in Viggen mission profiles. namely the destination indicator and the distance indicator, which can change in calibration between kilometers and a unit known as the Scandinavian mile, which is standardized at 10 kilometers. The remaining gauges on the front panel include the accelerometer, calibrated in G, the chronometer clock, and the angle of attack indicator. We also find on the front panel the thrust reverser handle and its indicator, the radio frequency selector, 3 autopilot switches, namely the SPAC flight damping and stabilization switch, the AT attitude hold switch, and the HUID altitude hold switch, the auto throttle indicator and an associated button, the master warning lights and reset button, the altitude warning light, the altitude source switch, the HUD slave switch, the stores released indicator, and the combined reverse thrust reduce indicator and transonic flight indicator. Dominating the top of the front dash is the Sichtlinjesindikator, or SI, standing for line of sight indicator, or more familiarly speaking, the heads-up display. The position of the SI heads-up display can be adjusted using the HUD angle adjustment lever here, and its brightness can be adjusted using the HUD brightness switch here. We also have the EP-13 collimated sight used in conjunction with the RB-75 Maverick air-to-surface missiles. Working our way along the left console, we find the following controls. Firstly, the curiously placed landing gear lever, the AFK automatic throttle control lever, the interior lighting control panel, the radar screen brightness control, the FR24 backup radio panel, the emergency trim switch panel, the autopilot channel selector panel, which is unsimulated, the autopilot yaw correction dial, the canopy jettison switch, the EP-13 collimated sight brightness and contrast controls, the radio control panel, which is unsimulated, the air conditioning panel, again which is unsimulated, the missile selector button used to cycle through the selected weapon hardpoints, and the Sidewinder Growl volume control. Proceeding forward, we find the throttle lever, which also contains switches and buttons for countermeasure release, Sidewinder uncage and fast select, and the air brakes, as well as a high-pressure fuel valve switch hidden within the assembly. The main controls for firing up the aircraft are placed forward of the throttle assembly, including the main power switch, the low-pressure fuel valve switch and associated indicator, the generator switch, the ignition system switch, the engine start switch, and the emergency engine restart switch. We also find the radar control panel, radar control stick and associated controls, the master mode selector dial, and the FR22 main V/UHF radio. There is also a switch to adjust the seat height here. At the left knee, we find the left warning table indicator lights, the cabin differential pressure indicator, the brake pressure manometer, the pitch trim indicator, and the roll trim centering reset button. We also find on the left wall the emergency lighting switch, which is non-functional, the taxi and landing light switch, the warning table indicator test button, the indicator lamp brightness switch, which is non-functional, a non-functional left emergency instruction placard light switch, and the countermeasure release mode switch. We also find the canopy control handle. Across to the right console, we find the right warning table indicator lights, the engine nozzle indicator, the exhaust gas temperature gauge, the oxygen pressure gauge, the oxygen valve switch, and a non-functional right emergency instruction placard light switch. Proceeding aft, we find the main controls for navigation and prosecution. This is the data panel, and is the main interface between pilot and the Viggen's CK-37 onboard central computer. This is the navigation panel, used to select waypoints, target points, and various other points of interest. This is the weapons panel, and is used to prepare weapon parameters and manage stores. We also find the TILS Instrument Landing System Channel Selector dial and its addition switch, the radar altimeter power switch, and the RB-05 missile steering control stick. Many of the other switches are either not simulated or are legacy switches from previous Viggen variants and are therefore not used. Of the remaining switches visible here, the Control Indicator System Test button, the Backup Generator switch, and the Pitch Gearing switch are functional. At the far aft of the right console, we find the U-22 Electronic Countermeasure Pod control panel, the KB Countermeasure Pod control panel, the Exterior Lighting control panel, a heading correction dial, a circuit breaker box, and an igniter switch. Sadly, the Viggen's IFF transponder and its associated functions are not yet simulated in DCS World. Other switches not mentioned are also either non-functional or not simulated. To our rear, we find the data cartridge slot and the ejector seat arming lever. On the front lower panel, we find a pedal adjustment lever, which is obviously non-functional, and the parking brake lever. The remaining switches, which primarily deal with cockpit lighting, are non-functional. On the control stick, we find the following controls. Obviously the trigger, which is used for weapons employment. Over the top of the stick is the trigger safety. This is an important control as it not only unsafes the trigger, but is also used to mark targets in the HUD during attack runs. The hat switch is of course a roll and pitch trim control. The red button is an autopilot disconnect button, used to regain free control of the aircraft quickly. This is the reference button, which is used for initial navigation fixes and setting reference altitudes. We also find the FR22 main radio transmit button and a non-functional event marking button. I start the next section with the usual caveat. I have always been reluctant to provide tutorials on key bindings, as I feel each pilot should develop a system that works for them, especially given the differing levels of input equipment that may be available to you. As you may know, I'm not a hardcore milsim-er, although I occasionally enjoy that sort of thing. Primarily, I just like to enjoy DCS World. So, to help digest the Hotas controls of the Viggen, I have divided them up into actual Hotas controls, suggested Hotas controls, and optional or panel controls, which make things easier. I will then share my preferred setup on my own Hotas. The actual Hotas controls are essential. Terminology used here is correct at the time of publication, in terms of the control bindings, so when you are assigning buttons in the controls menu, look out for these functions. So starting with the stick, weapon release is the term used for the trigger. As mentioned before, the trigger safety has an important use in the Viggen for target marking. You will need 2 buttons or stages, one each for arm and safe. Trim controls are definitely required, and you will need 4 buttons for nose up, nose down, left wing down, and right wing down. The autopilot quick disengage and reference button we have just seen in the previous section. The FR22 radio transmit button is our push to talk, which is best employed within the SRS standalone radio software. On the throttle, or rather within the throttle assembly, we have the high pressure fuel valve, which requires 2 positions for between cutoff and idle. We also need the IR missile uncage button bound to get the most out of our air-to-air missiles. Whilst chaff can be dispensed by other methods, the fast countermeasure dispense button is the only way to dispense flares, and so is essential. And finally, the essential air brake controls, for which you will need 2 positions. Considering the radar stick now, there are a number of buttons as listed here that will need to be bound somewhere. If you do not have the luxury of a second stick to act as the radar stick, I would recommend you bind as many of these as possible to buttons on your Hotas. Suggested Hotas controls, in my mind, will make flying the Viggen much more user-friendly. However, in reality, these controls are not on the stick or throttle. I like to have my autopilot controls handy, and you will need 2 buttons if you wish to apply them to the Hotas, one each for attitude and altitude hold. The RB-05 missile is MACLOS remote controlled by the pilot. At minimum you will need 4 buttons for each cardinal direction, or 2 axes. The auto throttle lever is also a useful control to have handy, for which you will need 2 buttons or a toggle. Wheel brakes are of course best mapped to toe pedals if you have them. The optional controls listed here could just as well be bound to keys on the keyboard, but I have these and others bound to Hotas controls or panel switches where possible. There are of course hundreds of different binding options to suit your tastes and available peripherals. Now I use a Winwing Orion 2 Hotas with the F-16 style controls, so my setup ends up being an amalgam of various aircraft that I fly, the Viggen, F-16, Mirages, Harrier, etc. So you may find this layout abhorrent. Nevertheless, this is what I use, and hopefully it will give you some ideas for your own bindings. So for the weapons release, I obviously use the trigger on the stick. For the trigger safety, I use 2 positions of the Orion 2's extension trigger assembly here. Trim controls as standard go on the trim hat in the 4 directions. Autopilot controls I prefer to have on this hat switch here on the side of the stick, and as I've stated before, I'm not sure why, I'm just used to them being there. I have the attitude hold bound to the push function and the altitude hold to the forward position. The autopilot quick disengage is bound to the aft position. I don't routinely turn off the SPAC autopilot damping, so this is not bound. The microphone button is bound outside of DCS World for SRS use, and I use this instantaneous switch here, backwards and forwards, for 2 radios. For the high pressure fuel valve cutoff, this is bound to the throttle idle detent button hidden in the lever of the Winwing Orion 2, which operates as the lever is moved from between off and idle. The auto throttle disconnect IR missile fast select is our dogfight switch, so I use the F-16's dogfight switch here. The IR missile uncage button is bound to the F-16's analog here. The fast countermeasure dispense button is bound to this bonus panic button on the rear of the throttle lever. The air brake is bound to the F-16 speed brake switch, aft for extend and forward for retract. A zoom view is essential in DCS World, and I use this axis wheel here for that purpose. For the radar stick, I have actually plugged in my old Thrustmaster T16000M to act in its stead, and most of the radar controls are bound to buttons on that. But if such an option is not available, you could bind the radar in a similar fashion to this. As for the optional Hotas and panel controls mentioned earlier, I have all of these bound on the throttle base of the Winwing Orion 2 or the Winwing PT-02 panel. Well, as ever, I hope that was useful for you and that you are looking forward to learning the art of the Viggen. With heartfelt gratitude to my patrons, especially Yan11, Lakota21, Plabs, Starlover and Ben. Your support is always faithfully received. Feel free to do the usual thing like subscribe, comment and share, but until next time, virtual aviators, keep on rocking and keep on flying. This is Reiver saying last call.